My name is Bill Johnson. I'm an extension weed scientist at Purdue University, and the topic that I'm going to discuss today relates to weed control issues across the soybean growing area of the United States. To gather information for this presentation, I solicited input from a number of my extension weed science colleagues at the land-grant universities across the Midwest and the Mid-South region. Today, I'm going to talk about a number of issues ranging from herbicide injury to herbicide carryover to weed control performance failures and how that can impact some of our future weed management challenges. In the first part of this presentation, I'm going to discuss a few issues that I kind of call weed control failures or situations where we've gotten somewhat variable control of weeds that we've normally done a better job of being able to stay on top of. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about Italian ryegrass, waterhemp, Palmer amaranth, kochia, grasses, and grasses including volunteer corn. The first topic we'll discuss is Italian ryegrass. This was primarily a control challenge in areas of Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, and some of the Mid-South soybean producing states. This control issue for folks in this region is almost as big as the waterhemp or mare's tail control issues that we have in the Midwest. The presence of glyphosate-resistant biotypes of Italian ryegrass are relatively widespread, and so alternative control measures are needed to control this weed if we're going to practice no-till production in corn, soybeans, or cotton. I think it's important to note here that many times we have what we call segregating populations, and you might control the ryegrass in certain parts of the field, but not other parts of the field, or you'll have populations of ryegrass that have been killed with your herbicide program, which are intermixed with populations that are not killed. The next issue I want to talk about is water hemp that's surviving applications of Dicamba and 2,4-D. Here's a picture of some populations that we are screening in our greenhouses at Purdue. We know that since this technology has come onto the market, that one of the primary reasons that it's being utilized is the fact that we need better tools for control of water hemp in the Midwest region than we currently had in our Roundup Ready systems that did not have other herbicide resistance traits. One of the things that we were concerned about when this technology came onto the market is the fact that both of these herbicides can be somewhat weak on water hemp, particularly if the plants have any size on them. So we know we've run into a number of situations where the application technology has been less than ideal in terms of carrier volume or adjuvant selection. We know that there's some cases where rates were cut or folks were trying to control large plants. But nonetheless, we've had a number of years of Dicamba selection pressure with Dicamba use in corn. And so it's not surprising that we started to see some control failures fairly quickly out of the gate, given the fact that we've used Dicamba in corn for over 30 years in most of the United States. I've got a couple of pictures here that have come up on the right-hand side of the screen. And essentially what these pictures show are water hemp plants that have escaped a Dicamba application. The picture on the top was a relatively large plant, and the Dicamba application basically burned the leaves off the plant. But water hemp is unique in that it has a lot of these axillary buds that lay dormant, and any kind of a stress like a herbicide application or mowing or even an animal biting off the top of this plant can initiate these axillary buds where you can get regrowth. And if this plant is allowed to continue to grow, this plant will produce seed. The plant on the bottom was probably sprayed at the height in which we would normally expect there to be control of water hemp by Dicamba. But what you can see in this particular situation is that the Dicamba application killed the growing point of the plant. The plant was able to initiate these buds at the base of the plant and grew branches from the base of the plant. And so you have a surviving plant that will produce seed. Just recently, both Tennessee and Illinois announced that they had water hemp that is resistant to Dicamba. And we had the chance to work with the water hemp population from Tennessee in our greenhouses this fall. And here's a field shot from this field in Tennessee that survived 3 applications of Dicamba in 2021 and also in 2020. This field had been in continuous soybeans, and Dicamba resistant soybeans had been grown in this field since the technology came onto the market about 5 years ago. Here are some pictures from the screen in the greenhouse that we did with this Tennessee population, a sensitive population, and also a couple of populations from Indiana. The populations from Indiana are on the right-hand side, and they are labeled as Fran and D-Fran. So what these images show are 7 plants from each population that were sprayed with a 1x rate of Dicamba. The plants are arranged from left to right based on the injury symptoms that were expressed following this 1x rate. So all the plants in the photograph, in all of the photographs, were sprayed with the same rate of Dicamba. And what you can see in the sensitive population is that we've killed 4 of the plants, and the other 3 are laid over and fairly sick looking. Most likely they would not survive in a field situation. In the Tennessee population, we didn't kill any of the plants, and the 3 or 4 plants on the left-hand side of the photograph are more or less upright, and they will recover fairly quickly from this Dicamba application. The Indiana plants are not quite as tolerant as the Tennessee plants, but you'll note that the first 2 plants in both the Fran and the D-Fran population look relatively healthy compared to the plants on the right-hand side of the photograph. So we have what we would call here as a population that's still segregating for resistance to Dicamba. So the plants on the left-hand side of this Fran and D-Fran photograph will survive and produce seed. But this is what the Tennessee population looks like in the greenhouse. In staying with the pigweed family, just this year, the University of Arkansas announced that they had confirmed glufosinate or Liberty-resistant Palmer amaranth in the state of Arkansas. There were 2 populations, one from Crittenden County and one from Mississippi County. The Crittenden County population was 3.5 times more resistant than a sensitive population, and the Mississippi County population was 15 times more resistant than a susceptible population. So this was the first confirmed case of glufosinate or Liberty resistance in Palmer amaranth. So this confirms then that Palmer amaranth has evolved resistance to 7 sites of action in Arkansas. So not every population has 7 sites of resistance, but I think the most concerning one is the fact that we have resistance to the group 15 or chloroacetamide herbicides, and this population is also resistant to the Auxin herbicides and glufosinate. So really we're kind of out of tools in terms of how to kill this particular population of Palmer amaranth. Now, moving on away from the pigweeds, we probably had more reports this summer of grasses other than Italian ryegrass inadequately controlled with glyphosate. And what we are pretty sure is happening in situations like this is, we do have some resistance evolution in weeds like barnyard grass and jungle rice. But I think the other thing that we're seeing is that as we're having to tank mix more herbicides with glyphosate to pick up broadleaf weeds, we're getting into some antagonism with the Auxin herbicides, but we're also seeing some antagonism with herbicides like Warrant or the chloroacetamide herbicides as well. So in particular, Johnson grass, barnyard grass, fall panicum were kind of our normal summer annual grass weeds that we struggled to control. Goosegrass is another one that's showing up as well. But then we're also seeing problems with control of volunteer corn with the ACCase herbicides like clethodim or quizalofop. So here's an example here of some work that we did at Purdue to basically look at the antagonistic effect of things like dicamba and the group 15 herbicides like acetochlor on the activity of clethodim, or the ability of clethodim to control volunteer corn. So in the upper left-hand corner, we have clethodim at 4 ounces tank mixed with dicamba plus glyphosate. You can see that the volunteer corn is controlled about 80 to 90% in this particular slide. And if we move to the slide just below that, or to the picture just below that, we increase the rate of clethodim to 6 ounces per acre, and we got much better control of volunteer corn. So the low rate of clethodim was antagonized by dicamba. Now, if we take a look at the photographs on the right-hand side, we have the same 2 rates of clethodim, 4 ounces and 6 ounces. Dicamba and glyphosate is also in the mixture, but in addition to dicamba and glyphosate, we've also added acetochlor. And you can see that the addition of acetochlor resulted in some fairly significant antagonism, more so at the 4 ounce rate, but we also saw some antagonism at the 6 ounce rate as well. So again, some of these things that we add to our herbicide tank mixtures to give us better control of broadleaf weeds are starting to antagonize some of the grass control, with corn being a grassy type weed. We see the same thing happening with quizalofop. And if anything, quizalofop is more easily antagonized than clethodim is. So in the top left-hand photo, we have quizalofop at 4 ounces per acre, tank mixed with dicamba plus glyphosate, very poor control. In the photograph just below that, when we increase the rate to 6 ounces per acre, we get a little bit better control, but it's still not perfect. And you can see that we're getting, again, the antagonistic effect of dicamba plus glyphosate. When we add acetochlor to it, the control is poor as well. So again, it happens with clethodim. It can also happen with quizalofop, and those are probably the 2 most common herbicides that we're going to use for volunteer corn control in soybeans. So in addition to some of the more standard herbicide performance issues that we saw in the soybean growing areas, we're also seeing a reemergence of what we would call some older weed problems. And I've just listed some of those here on this slide. So burr cucumber, a weed that emerges late in the year, is reemerging as a weed problem in the eastern Midwest states. Velvet leaf, we haven't talked about velvet leaf for probably a decade and a half. It's reemerging as a weed in the Midwest. Cocklebur is reemerging as a weed problem in the Midwest. Kochia in the northern plains areas, North Dakota, South Dakota, was a big problem this year, particularly with the drought conditions. Sickle pod in the Mid-South area used to be a huge problem before the advent of Roundup Ready soybeans, and it's reemerging. Prickly Sida, we have some of that in the southern part of the Midwest and also in the Mid-South area. And then annual bluegrass, which is a winter annual grass, has become more problematic in our burn down situations in the spring. So those are kind of a listing of some of the weed problems that used to be a problem about 2 decades ago. The Roundup Ready technology kind of made them go away, but now they seem to be reemerging as weed problems in our current systems. So now I'm going to shift away from some of the more general weed control issues into some more what I would call weed science issues. So again, as I surveyed my colleagues from across the Midwest, there's a number of things that were mentioned, but these, well, probably 3 issues here were probably the ones that rose to the top in many states. So due to some dry weather that most of the soybean growing area had in the latter part of the 2020 growing season and the early part of the 2021 growing season, we had some situations with herbicide carryover. Since we have roughly equal amounts of enlist and extend soybeans grown in many areas of the U.S., We still have some, or we do have some issues with applying the wrong herbicide to the wrong soybean trait. And so that resulted in some relatively large fields being destroyed and replanted. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about off-target movement of dicamba, and then we'll finish up here with some discussion of the herbicide shortage. So for most of the Midwest, anyway, the most common herbicide carryover issue that we've seen over the last couple of years has been Mesotrione, or Callisto carryover is one of the common names. So typically this is going to happen when we have dry weather conditions. It's also more prevalent on soil types that tend to be low CEC soil types. So we have a couple of pictures here of the symptoms of this carryover, and what you see in the top photograph are kind of the long skinny leaves. You see a little bit of bleaching. You see kind of a rough texture as well on these leaves. In the bottom photograph, you'll see more of the bleaching. And if you look closely in the upper left-hand corner of that photograph, you can see some of the rough texture that occurs on these leaves as well. So a number of different things influence herbicide carryover, but the big one is weather. If we have really dry weather, particularly in the summer and early spring, that's when we see more herbicide carryover. Of course, things like texture, pH, and organic matter can influence that as well, but dry weather is almost always the most important one. And there's about 3 different herbicides that carry over to soybean more frequently. One of them is Atrax. The second one are the HPPD inhibitors, like we just talked about here in the last slide. And another one that's kind of emerging is clopyralid. And I think some of the clopyralid carryover that we're seeing now is due to the rise in use of herbicides like Resicor in our corn production systems. One of the other things that we discuss when we talk about herbicide carryover is not only our summer crops, but also our cover crops. With cover crop use growing, there's a huge amount of interest in how do we manage our residual herbicides to minimize the amount of herbicide carryover. And I've got a couple of slides here that I'll use to kind of show, how do we develop some of these recommendations for which cover crops are safe to plant. So in this particular slide, what we've got is we've got 6 different herbicides: Dual, Zidua, Valor, Spartan, Flexstar, and Pursuit. And in experiments conducted in 6 different states, we basically looked at the results of our research and what would constitute our recommendation as far as whether or not it would be safe to plant cereal rye after these herbicides were used in soybean. So what you can see here with cereal rye is anywhere we have a green box, that would imply that in that particular situation, we feel like it's safe to plant cereal rye after use of that herbicide. A yellow box would indicate a caution, and a red box would indicate, boy, you better watch out because that one has some potential for herbicide carryover. And so what we see with cereal rye is, for the most part, we think that one is pretty safe in all 6 states to all 6 herbicides. We did run into a couple of situations in Indiana in one year, but not the other year, where we saw a little bit of injury with Spartan in Pursuit. But in all other cases, that one appeared to be relatively safe following the use of these herbicides. We've generated similar graphics for a couple of other cover crop species. We haven't done all of them, but we've done several of them. This is annual ryegrass. And what you can see here is the annual ryegrass is a little bit more sensitive to herbicide residues than cereal rye is. Wisconsin, Indiana, and Missouri all noted some problems with Zidua. Pursuit was problematic in Wisconsin and Indiana. And so what you can see here is this one is not quite as resilient in terms of being able to survive herbicide residues as we see with cereal rye. The next one we'll look at is a broadleaf species. This is clover. And what you can see here with clover is that Pennsylvania saw some problems with Valor, Spartan, and Flexstar. Flexstar was also a problem in Missouri and Virginia. In Wisconsin, we saw problems with Dual and Valor. And so For the most part, again, I think we can feel like we're fairly safe in using Pursuit. We may want to be a little bit careful with Flexstar, but with Zidua Dual, those herbicides appear to be fairly safe in most cases as well. And the fourth species that I'll show some information on here is radish. So with radish, we see problems with Flexstar and Pursuit, but it looks like Dual and Zidua are pretty safe. Excuse me, Valor and Spartan would be somewhat intermediate. So if we wanted to kind of generate some general comments about herbicide carryover and cover crops, this is kind of the summary that I would use here. And I'm not going to read all this to you, but essentially the herbicides to kind of be a little bit careful with in corn would be atrazine, some of the group 27 herbicides like Callisto and Stinger. Soybean herbicides, it really kind of depends on the species, but Classic, Pursuit, and First Rate and Flexstar could be a problem for some of the broadleaf species, but for the most part, our cereal grains will be okay. And then again, our group 15 herbicides can be somewhat problematic for annual ryegrass, not for cereal rye, and generally pretty safe for our broadleaf species. The next topic we're going to talk about is off-target movement of auxin herbicides. So one of the things that I did is I solicited comments from all of my colleagues in the soybean producing areas in the United States. And I've got a few general comments here, and then we'll talk about some specific data as I move through this section. So in terms of the year in general, as far as herbicide drift, every year we see some drift potential with herbicides like Sharpen, 2,4-D, Glyphosate, and Dicamba. These drift incidences occur during the burn down season. And depending on the weather patterns on the day when these things are applied, we see a few cases of these every year. Now, shifting over to the auxin herbicide movement issue, in terms of official cases reported to regulatory agencies, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Missouri, and Kentucky had fewer cases than they had in the past several years. North Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa had more cases. And I think some of the drought conditions and just the slow speed at which soybeans recovered from these were part of the cause there. Illinois, Wisconsin, and Arkansas had about the same amount as they'd had in previous years. So one of the things I think to keep our fingers on, or to keep our eyes on as we're moving forward, is in the Midwest, we're seeing a rapid shift from Extend to Enlist happening. So just to give you an example, in 2021, we had roughly the same amount of each technology, about 35% of the soybean acres of each. And in 2022, it looks like we're going to be closer to a 2-to-1 ratio of Extend to Enlist. So we're kind of seeing a movement away from Extend to the Enlist technology. So that should reduce the amount of Dicamba that moves off target, but it will most likely increase the amount of 2,4-D that moves off target. In the Mid-South area, because cotton is so sensitive to 2,4-D, that many of the acres down there will stay in the Extend system because the Extend system is safer for an adjacent cotton crop than the Enlist technology is. So that's kind of a general trend of what is happening from a regulatory standpoint in terms of off-target movement throughout the soybean growing areas with auxin herbicides. So one of the things that I wanted to point out in this presentation as well is that there is a publication available that can help you differentiate 2,4-D from Dicamba injury on soybeans. So the link to this publication is listed at the bottom of this slide here. And one of the reasons that we produced this was because we anticipated that there would be a large acreage of soybeans that are planted to one technology or the other and grown in close proximity to one another. And it's really not that difficult to separate between the two. So one of the things that you'll notice is that with 2,4-D, you get what we call leaf strapping, which basically means it looks like you grab the end of the leaves and pulled them apart. You'll see more stem twisting and callus tissue formation on the stems as well. With Dicamba, you don't get nearly as much injury on the stems, but you'll see what we call leaf cupping. So you won't see the strapping, but you'll see where the leaves have cupped up. And I have some pictures that I can show you. The other thing to keep in mind is that with dicamba, soybean injury and yield loss can occur with less than 1% of the application rate. Also, the symptoms are slower to develop and the injury will persist longer throughout the growing season. With 2,4-D, plants will show injury literally within hours after exposure. And this is most obvious by the leaves that droop. They basically look like they're drought stressed. The soybeans grow out of it if they're just exposed to drift rates, and then we observe yield loss at about 5% of the field rate. Another important thing to keep in mind is that herbicide contamination is allowable based on EPA rules, and as long as the contamination is less than a certain percentage of the final formulation. So we know there are generic formulations of 2,4-D that can have small amounts of dicamba contamination and still be under the EPA mandated rules. And so it's very easy to tell sometimes which soybeans have been treated with generic formulations of 2,4-D when they show dicamba injury symptoms. And then with both technologies, the yield losses vary depending on the growth stage at the time of exposure and the environmental conditions when the soybeans are trying to recover. And I think another important thing to note is that a number of us have done work with Liberty, 2,4-D, and AMS to try to duplicate some of the leaf cupping that's allegedly caused by these chemicals, and we have just not seen this in our research program. So again, to kind of talk about the symptomology. So on the left-hand side, we see plants that have been exposed to 2,4-D. You see the strapping of the leaves in the top left photograph. You see the damage to the stems, including the stem bending and the callus formation. So the left-hand photographs are 2,4-D. The center photographs are dicamba, and you'll notice a very distinctive leaf cupping. And then the right-hand photographs are soybeans that have been exposed to high rates of group 15 herbicides. And so you'll notice the heart-shaped leaves in the upper right-hand photograph, and you'll notice the bumpy texture of the leaves in the lower right-hand photograph. So again, 2,4-D on the left, dicamba in the center, and acetochlor on the right. Okay, the last topic we'll talk about then is some things related to the herbicide shortage. And the herbicide shortage that we're currently going through right now has been caused by a number of different things. Many of you have probably heard about the glyphosate plant that was shut down after the hurricane. There's also a number of supply chain issues related to inert ingredients, packaging materials, and transportation that have been discussed as well as far as the reasons for the herbicide shortage. But nonetheless, here are some of the things that we know as of today. We know that glyphosate is in short supply, both straight goods and pre-mixed packages. The cost estimates are at least 4x from a year ago, sometimes as high as 6x already. And in some cases, the availability and cost to the grower is not provided until glyphosate has been delivered to the retailer. So in some cases, the prices are still unknown for 2022. We've also heard that glufosinate is going to be really short for 2022. And basically the retailers have been allocated something that amounts to about 80% of their 3-year average use. And so we do have a pretty significant shortage of those two active ingredients, and those two active ingredients are arguably the two most used, particularly in soybeans, that we've seen over the last certainly 4 or 5 years. So one of the things that's being discussed is clethodim is most commonly cited as a replacement for glyphosate. However, it's important to keep in mind that although clethodim is a good herbicide, it's still not quite as good of a grass herbicide as glyphosate, and it certainly doesn't work as well in cool weather conditions in the burn down as glyphosate does. And the other thing to point out too is it's probably more likely to be antagonized by broadleaf herbicides than glyphosate is as well. I think one of the other things that we need to make sure that we understand as well is that the shortage of glyphosate is a big deal, because even though we have a pretty significant number of glyphosate resistant weeds, glyphosate, even on a resistant weed, can help the main herbicide work better. And here's just an example of some demonstration type of things that we're using in winter meetings, where basically we have a glyphosate resistant water hemp plant treated with dicamba. And we know, again, water hemp can be occasionally poorly controlled by dicamba, but having glyphosate in with the dicamba can make the dicamba work better on the weed. So again, I think it's really important to note that just taking glyphosate out of the tank may result in poorer control of many of our broadleaf weeds with the main herbicides that we're using to control them. I think the other thing that's become really evident is, because we have to plan for a herbicide shortage, is that we're going to have to do a better job of understanding which weeds are prevalent in specific fields, and kind of designing a plan B or a plan C approach in the event that we can't get enough glyphosate to make a second or third application. And I think that's one of the big things to plan for the upcoming growing season is, what if I can only get enough glyphosate to spray each field one time rather than 2 times or 3 times? So what's going to be the approach to make glyphosate have the most bang for the buck in situations like that? And that's where things like weed control guides, and not only ours, but those that are produced by other states, or those that are produced by some of the retailer or basic manufacturers as well. So there's been a number of newsletter articles that have been written on this topic. Some of them have been pretty thorough in how you can approach the herbicide shortage issue. And again, I think most of them kind of get back to this point of, assume you can get enough glyphosate or glufosinate for one trip across the field, but how do I control weeds in the event that I need to make a second or third trip across the field? So figuring out the best way to utilize glyphosate or glufosinate, or both, if you can get your hands on both of them, to make your other herbicides more effective as well. So to kind of summarize this up, the supply shortage poses a significant challenge, even when our fields have major problems with glyphosate resistant weeds, because glyphosate makes some of the stronger herbicides work even better. We know that the glufosinate will be in short supply as well, even more of a shortage than we're seeing with glyphosate. So I think it's going to be really important to know which weeds you're going after to optimize full rates of residual herbicides, and try to put as much weight on those herbicides as possible. But I also think too, just having a backup plan is probably going to be most important, and probably more important than we've seen in the last 30 years or so, is to have that backup plan, so you have something that you can do in the event that you can't get your hands on enough glyphosate.